All right. So welcome everyone to Maurice Sendak and Queer Perspective. My name is Greg Newton. I'm the co-founder with my partner,
Donnie Jokum.
We're the co-founders of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division. We're a queer bookstore inside the LGBT Community Center in New York City. We like to say that we're a government agency for a government that does not yet exist, and we're here to serve you, queer communities of the world, especially New York, but especially these days, the world. So we're super happy that you were able to join us tonight for this event. And we wanted to let you know that we also have an online bookstore where you can buy Golan's book and books by Jack. We'll get some books by Kenneth up there soon. And the book for tonight is 25% off, and that's through the end of day today. So I'll put that in the link later. We are also going to do a Q&A later. So if you have any questions, you can put those in the chat function and I will read those aloud. We'll do that, at the last 15 minutes or so. So I think that's it for housekeeping. Oh, one more thing. I did turn on closed captioning. So if you would like that feature, you can turn that on and the computer will do the magic. So I'm going to read the bios of our participants and we'll get started. All right. So Jack Halberstam is professor of gender studies and English at Columbia University. Halberstam is the author of 7 books, including Skin Shows, Gothic Horror, and the Technology of Monsters, Female Masculinity, In a Queer Time and Place, The Queer Art of Failure, Gaga Feminism, Sex, Gender, and the End of Normal, and a short book titled Trans, a quick and quirky account of gender variance. Halberstam's latest book, 2020, from Duke University Press, is titled Wild Things, the Disorder of Desire. Places Journal awarded Halberstam its Arcus Places Prize in 2018 for innovative public scholarship on the relationship between gender, sexuality, and the built environment. Halberstam is now finishing a 2nd volume on wildness titled The Wild Beyond, Music, Architecture, and Anarchy. So we've got a wild night ahead of us. Kenneth Kidd is professor of English at the University of Florida, where he also serves as associate director of the Center for Children's Literature and Culture. He's the author of 3 monographs, Making American Boys, Boyology and the Feral Tale, Freud in Oz, at the intersections of psychoanalysis and children's literature, and Theory for Beginners, Children's Literature as Critical Thought. He has co-edited Wild Things, Children's Culture and Eco-Criticism, Over the Rainbow, Queer Children's and Young Adult Literature, Prizing Children's Literature, The Cultural Politics of Children's Book Awards, and Queer as Camp, Essays on Summer Style and Sexuality. With Elizabeth Marshall, he co-edits the Routledge series Children's Literature and Culture. And finally, Golan Moskowitz is assistant professor of Jewish studies at Tulane University, where he teaches courses on Jewish gender and sexuality, American pop culture, Holocaust studies, and comics and graphic novels. He is the author of Wild Visionary, Maurice Sendak in Queer Jewish Context, Stanford University Press 2020, and of several publications on intergenerational memory in post-Holocaust family narratives. So please give a warm welcome, put your hands together so they can see us clapping, and give them all a welcome. And Golan, welcome.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation to have this event, Greg and Donnie, and it's really a privilege to have this conversation with Jack Halberstam and Kenneth Kidd, whose work I so admire and rely upon in many ways in my own thinking and writing. I should mention Kenneth was also on my dissertation committee, so has a different kind of level of intimate familiarity with the work. So what I'm going to do is offer just a few minutes, about 10 minutes of a reading excerpt from the book itself. I'm going to be looking at my computer screen rather than the physical copy so I can kind of jump around quickly. After that, we'll have some conversation in which Kenneth offers some responses, Jack offers responses, and then we will have some Q&A. So this work as a whole, there are a few different ways I could describe it in this context, but one way to think about it is the intention that I had of kind of redeeming or reconsidering Maurice Sendak's legacy and body of work. I think that in some ways, Sendak is remembered as a kind of lovable, if somewhat crotchety or grouchy grandparent figure who offers a kind of wildness that is sometimes presented in very cute or domesticated forms. And I really look at Sendak as also a survivor of the wildness of the 20th century, of the Holocaust, the AIDS crisis, whether personally or in once removed forms, of the society in which he grew in multiple respects. And I think his body of work is a testament to that survival and speaks to that in a really interesting set of ways. So I'm going to read to you just briefly from the introduction and then a short part of one of my chapters, chapter 2. So beginning here, regardless of the extent to which Sendak was aware of being gay as a child, he was aware of being socially queer, a sickly boy whom others called a sissy, and a dramatic storyteller who struggled to make friends and spent much of his time with his family indoors. He was, in his own words, a terrified child growing into a withdrawn, stammering boy who became an isolated and untrusting young man. Coming of age in the homophobic 40s and 50s, Sendak learned to be contextually discreet and cultivated an ability to pass in order to avoid persecution. Aware of his same-sex attractions by his teenage years, he was exuberantly out to his friends and colleagues throughout his adult life, but he would not come out to the mainstream press as gay until 2008, at the ripe age of 80. He felt pressure to participate in the wider society's desire not to see this truth about their favorite children's book artist. Warding off the potential discomfort of readers who would prefer not to know about Sendak's sexuality or about the shared life he built with another man, Eugene Glynn, countless articles and books refer to Sendak as a lifelong bachelor and to his male partner as his friend, a euphemism Sendak admittedly also used at times protecting his career. The artistic form of the picture book enabled Sendak to powerfully articulate his liminal subjectivity. Children's literature, like comic books and other low art forms, so to speak, offered a way to hide in plain sight, a place from which to be loud and passionate and emotionally honest, even when the adult public deemed the contents of one's imagination queer or excessive. In a later interview, he reflected on why he worked in the picture book form, concluding that, and I quote him, I did not have much confidence in myself, never, and so I hid inside this modest form called the children's book and expressed myself entirely. I'm like a guerrilla warfare in my best books. Children's publishing as a field was also queer in the mid-century public's imagination, which perceived it as a feminine, marginal realm of peculiarities not worthy of serious attention. As Sendak recalls, children's books were at the bottom of the cultural totem pole in the 1940s and 50s. Despite appreciating the liberties of the field's liminality, the artist would also resent the diminutive and disrespectful attitudes expressed toward children's publishing. He once exclaimed, "What is a children's book artist? A moron, some ugly pipsqueak of a person who can't be bothered to grow up. That's the way we're treated in the adult world of publishing." Even when he won the Caldecott Award for Where the Wild Things Are, his father Philip joked, "Well, now maybe they'll give you a grown-up book to do." Sendak was consequentially a warrior for the cause of dignifying children's literature. Considering the inherently queer nature of childhood against the public sphere, his drive to dignify children's literature was, however indirectly, a drive to earn respect in the public sphere for queer perspectives, as naturalized in the universality of childhood queerness vis-a-vis the adult world. Like the field of queer studies, Sendak's best work explores how subjects occupy alternate realms of affect, embodiments, and social formations, states of limbo beyond hegemonic or coercive structures. The Sendakian child uses fantasy realms as a means to survive a turbulent and unjust society, refusing emotional erasure by the rules of that society. As theorist Catherine Von Stockton has argued, queer children who grow up in cultures that will not recognize them tend to claim their queerness only through the ghostly retrospect of adulthood, as grown-ups who may belatedly assert, "I was a queer child," but who can never in the moment state, "I am a queer child." Literary and cultural studies scholars have recently employed queer theory to understand childhood itself as a queer realm, inherently estranged from adult social norms and perspectives. Children, as human subjects varyingly excluded from mainstream public society, fluctuate between embracing the boundless possibilities of play and wanting to grow up to gain inclusion within the rules of that wider society as well. Thus, even beyond the categories of gender and sexuality, children's literature has a history of beckoning to queer adults whose social identities are forbidden from manifesting in the culture. Adults whose endangered emotional worlds propel them toward intimate familiarity with the void, so to speak, and toward languages that approximate what it means to exist beyond, between, or prior to the laws of society. Born of tormented beginnings, painful exclusions, and belated self-actualizations, the field of modern children's literature conveys an urgency and an emotional vitality that speaks to the queerness and cherished peculiarity of all children vis-a-vis the adult public sphere. The present study contributes to a wider project of uncovering a growing history of queer understandings of childhood in general, and dignified representations of queer childhood specifically. So now I'm going to read to you a bit from chapter 2, which is titled Love in a Dangerous Landscape, Queer Kinship and Survival. At the height of Sendak's career in the 1970s, an essay in the underground gay alternative pointed to him along with James Marshall and Edward Gorey as characteristic proponents of a gay sensibility in children's literature that prioritized a lushness and peculiarity of imagination, generally disinclined to present the happy, radiant, nuclear family situation so characteristic of conventional children's literature. Indeed, a great part of Sendak's appeal to those modern children bound to domestic norms has been his emotional bravery to search beyond them. In his own life, he perceived the rhythms of the traditional nuclear family as directly at odds with his needs and capacities as an artist. He would contrast himself with the late Herman Melville, for example, who he thought was ill-equipped to be a husband or father, but became so anyway, causing suffering to himself and his family. Sendak instead consciously avoided social expectations, reserving himself to focus fully on his art and accepting any associated limitations that imposed on his life. The artist's atypical stances on kinship, like his interest in the dark and complex sides of childhood, were inseparable from his queerness and his proximity to Jewish historical trauma. Though the Sendaks lived in Brooklyn during World War II, the Holocaust destroyed his parents' communities of origin and took the lives of most of their relatives. Reactions to these events thwarted some of the formative moments in the artist's adolescence, complicating his initiation into adult society. But they also intensified his internalization of family mythology and his creative meaning-making around parent-child and sibling bonds. And here I gesture toward queer kinship and look more in depth at that concept in Sendak's work in this chapter. I'm skipping forward a bit. Perhaps most striking among his imagined fusions, the artist often described himself as pregnant or birthing when discussing his creative project. For Sendak, the inspiration for a new book felt like, as he stated, getting pregnant when you've just gone crazy and you found out your house has burned down. Something complex, I think, is at work in his tendency to understand his artistic work as a process of pregnancy and birthing. Perhaps imagining himself as pregnant helped him to process the powerlessness he experienced as a child bombarded with the news of lost relatives, possessed by the mourning of others, but also cosmically bound to those inaccessible others, as pregnant mothers are to the emergent offspring that they carry. Phantom pregnancy may have helped Sendak also to find some control over the process of emotional impregnation, involving growing up effectively arrested by preceding traumas, narratives, or cultures to which one cannot gain sufficient access, but nevertheless remains bound. Creating more personal meanings around his own emotional experience of indirect traumas, Sendak described his finished books as his offspring, which he could birth and mourn on his own terms, as though granting himself access to his own obstructed genealogical roots and reenacting their loss. And I quote him here on his description of what it felt like to finish a book. And then finally, it is a book. How strange. And then it goes out into the world. And your child, this book, who was so private and who was living with you for 2 years, now is everybody's child. Some people knock him on the head, some kick him in the rump, and others like him very much. From a queer perspective, Sendak's male pregnancy also speaks to the unusual interiority of his work as a deeply personal harvesting of buried emotional content for public consumption, a traditionally unconventional venture for the American man. If the queer or allegedly threatening child is forbidden from existing as such during childhood, as Stockton argues, that child might be retroactively recovered or rebirthed. This queer birthing touches feelings usually forgotten or suppressed by the socialized adult. In this way, according to Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, it follows a tendency of the British realist writer Henry James, one of Sendak's favorite authors. Sedgwick writes that James repeatedly invokes Frankenstein and all the potential uncanniness of the violently disavowed male birth in order to undo it, by offering the spectacle of not his refusal, but his eroticized eagerness to recognize his progeny, even in its oddness. On some level, Sendak, like James, may have used the motif of male birthing to affirm the worth of what Sedgwick calls the maimed or slighted, the disfigured or defeated, the unlucky or unlikely child. The specter of a man birthing might symbolically deem his offspring queer in their odd, exceptional nature, and it might position Sendak as a parental protector of those who do not belong in conventional bourgeois families that restrict certain possibilities. Sendak's pop-up picture book, Mommy, from 2006, which I have right here, would depict a small boy seeking his mother among a cast of male creatures. One of them, resembling popular depictions of Frankenstein's monster, stands beside his own framed baby picture. I'll show you that image here. Full pop-up experience. In another image, we see a monster who resembles Sendak in physical build, wearing red high heels like Dorothy in Oz. And the Wizard of Oz was a great source of inspiration for Sendak, as I explore in my book. The dominant visual conception of Frankenstein's monster, as originally performed by Boris Karloff, derives, of course, from the 1931 film Frankenstein from Sendak's childhood. Sendak sympathized with this and other misunderstood monsters of old world Hollywood, calling them early wild things. And I think it's interesting the focus on the wolf and the wolf man, which was the 1941 Hollywood film that influenced Sendak, whose screenwriter was someone who took refuge from Nazi Germany, who escaped Nazi Germany narrowly, and whose inventions around this legend of the wolf, the werewolf myth, included, for example, references to a pentagram that would appear on someone's hand, which is analyzed as related to the yellow star badges that Jews were forced to wear during the Holocaust. So there's an intertwinement here of 1930s popular culture, realities happening in Europe, and notions of wildness and danger and of othering. So Hollywood monsters depicted as lumbering, helpless creatures who invoke fear in others and struggle to communicate in coherent English, or like immigrants, traumatized subjects, or children who struggle to bridge inner feelings with concrete social language, queer or not. The real monsters Sendak felt were not these unfortunate beings, but the people with torches who assaulted them in the films, the dangerous masses who scapegoated and who demonized outsiders. So that excerpt, I think, brings into play some of the themes of my book, and I'm going to pause there and hand it over to Kenneth and Jack to hear your thoughts and responses, and looking forward to a conversation with all of you.
Great, thank you so much, Golan. That's really fabulous. Exactly. Where's my clap? function there. So it's such an honor and a privilege really to be here with Jack and with Golan, and also just thank you to our hosts with the Bureau of General Services, the Queer Division. I love that. Thank you, Greg and Donnie, for having us. Very, very fun. So this is apparently a wild panel in many ways. The three of us have published books with wild in the title. So I guess that the Wild Rumpus continues. I suspect this one will have more words in it. But I'm sure it'll be equally beautiful. I am actually wearing a Wild Things bow tie. I don't know how visible it is. And then also kind of Austin, Texas sort of riff on the whole Wild Things conceit. It's a little harder to find merchandise based on, say, In the Night Kitchen or Down in the Dumps with Jack and Guy. In any case, we have serious queer expertise in the house tonight, as well as children's literature expertise too. So I think that's fabulous. And I can't wait to hear questions and discussion. And just want to acknowledge that my co-editor, Derek Mason, is here, who I did the Queer as Camp book with. And I think Michelle Abate also, a very important voice for queer studies and children's literature. I had the privilege of working with her on a book project called Over the Rainbow, and lots of other amazing people. David Pratt, it's nice to actually see you for the first time. Any case, I'm supposed to give reactions to the book, and the short version is that it's really kick-ass. I mean, this is kind of a transformative, fabulously researched, deeply felt, beautifully written, and I think very important book. And it's the book on Sendak that we've always needed. And we kind of knew that. And finally, someone has written it. Golan has fulfilled his destiny. Now, this is one of many destinies that he will fulfill, but it could not be more timely and appreciated. And I just think it's really quite magical and quite wonderful. And I think, there have been previous studies of Sendak's life and work, but they haven't really fully engaged the kind of the full dimensions of that life for multiple reasons. And I think they've tended a little bit toward kind of archetypal readings of the works, which might have partly been in a way to kind of help sort of children's literature level up and think about sort of Sendak as in fact, a master artist, which he was, obviously. But in any case, Golan tells the story of not just a narrowly gay, right, but a kind of expansively queer / wild Sendak. And he's talked a little bit about some of the ways he does that in the book, and I'll try not to repeat that. I'm going to try to keep this short. But I mean, in the book, Golan shows how Sendak's life and work both kind of pushes against and also aligns with the zeitgeist of the times. And he kind of traces that really across decades and decades and decades, from sort of Sendak's early sense of kind of outsider status as a kind of non-reproducing old world Jewish world, identified Yiddish speaking, closeted artist in the kind of immediate post-war period to really to someone who becomes almost a kind of I don't know if spokesperson's right, but a kind of figure for the sort of gentle rebellions, the 60s and 70s. Not that those were gentle rebellions, but I mean, there's a kind of association of Sendak with that all the way up to the end of his life and his work on themes like homelessness and HIV/AIDS. So all of that is in this book. And I think at one point, Golan, you say that Sendak didn't write so much for the child as through the child. And I think that's a lovely way to put it. And I think in this book, you're writing for Sendak, but also through him in many ways. I think this feels like a book about Sendak and us, in the kind of most expansive sense of us, which I really appreciate. As a children's literature scholar, I really appreciate the work that the book does to show how Sendak's career is really intertwined with the history of children's literature in the United States. From really sort of earlier in the 20th century to the early decade of the first decade or so of the 21st century. It's anybody who's interested in children's literature studies needs to get and read this book, and ideally buy it from Greg and Donnie, or buy it through Greg and Donnie, right? Clearly. He also does, I think, a fantastic job of identifying the kind of emotional and psychological aspects of Sendak's life, his obsessions and anxieties, but without kind of diagnosing him. I think you come away from a sense of, with a better sense of Sendak's complex personality, but without losing the feeling of mystery that really, and just richness there. So that's something I think that was incredibly well done in the book. And obviously there, in terms of the psychology issue, there are a lot of relays more broadly between children's literature and psychology, and this has been a research interest of mine. And Sendak's work is hugely important, both on its own and I think in that context. I wrote about him at one point as part of what I call picture book psychology, which kind of brings together two traditions, at least, like a sort of realistic, everyday child observation-based practice of, sort of observing children, writing about them, writing realistic urban stories, with a tradition that really emphasizes fantasy, fairy tales, imaginative, sort of engagements. And they're exclusive, but I think you do see both of them coming together beautifully in this work. And as Golan made very clear, it's also a very important queer childhood studies project, and also queer children's literature studies project. And those aren't necessarily the same thing, but they're very close. Obviously, there's a rich tradition of thinking about the child in queer studies and queer theory, from Sedgwick and Moon's discussion of the proto-gay child, to even the opening in the preface to Gender Trouble. Judith Butler talks about herself as a girl all perpetually in trouble. And it's just a lovely moment in that book, and kind of then the ways in which that, sort of sets up the conversation is really quite interesting. So that conversation is there in queer studies and queer theory, and you certainly see it in other key works, Erica Rand's Barbie's Queer Accessories. You see it in Stephen Broom and Natasha Hurley's really important 2004 collection, Curiouser, which deals a little bit with Alice, but also with a number of other texts and contexts, all the way through, obviously, Catherine Von Stockton's, very, very important work, The Queer Child, and then into recent work on trans children by Tay Meadows and Jill Peterson, among other people, really, really important things. In terms of children's literature studies, I think what's exciting to me, and I should say what's exciting to me now too, is that queer theory is sort of getting more and more interested in children's and young adult texts. There is a discussion, for example, in Sarah Ahmed's A Promise of Happiness of Nancy Garden's YA novel, Annie on My Mind. And then of course, Jack's Queer Out of Failure deals with Pixar animation, which is at least adjacent in some ways, right, to sort of, especially visual traditions of children's literature. And now with Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire, I think it's the first time queer theory has really engaged at length with an important work of children's literature, and certainly with the picture book, and really in many ways the picture book, right? Probably the most canonical picture book so far, at least in the Anglophone tradition. So I think that's pretty exciting. And I think obviously, children's literature studies has had a focus on queer studies for some time. And so I just think that possibilities for all of this continue to be really rich and untapped. And children's literature is such a wackily queer enterprise. It can be deeply normative, but it's also deeply not so normative, right? With its eccentric characters and wacky plots and kinship structures and bizarre landscapes, and not to mention endless subjects, right? Some of them very canonical, who are very odd, from Mary Poppins to Pippi Longstocking to the Moomin Trolls. I mean, many, many examples out there, right? So Golan talks about some of this stuff, and actually the passage he read from the introduction, I was going to read myself, and I'll repeat it really quickly and then wind down. He wrote, like the field of queer studies, Sendak's best work explores how subjects occupy alternate realms of affect, embodiment, and social formats, states of limbo beyond hegemonic or coercive structures. And so I think, I made the case in my Theory for Beginners book that children's literature could be thought of, some of it anyway, as a form of queer theory. It may not have the kind of a certain tradition of critique that we're used to seeing as critique, but a lot of queer theory is speculative, experimental in form, utopian, right? All of these elements are there, I think, in some of our most richly imagined children's books, and it certainly is true in the case of Sendak's larger body of work. So I'll stop just by repeating that Wild Visionary is just really a game changer of a book, super important for all of us, and it's just a real joy to be able to signal boost it and to have a discussion of it. So, Dr. Halberstam.
Thanks, Kenneth, for setting up the way that we might consider this book in relationship to the intersection between children's literature and queer theory. And Golan, thank you so much for this book. I only wish I had had a chance to read it before I started working with Where the Wild Things Are in my book, Wild Things. It just explains so much to me, and it does so in a really enchanting way. It's a really well-told story. Sendak is a super interesting guy. His story of being closeted and, you know, finding a relationship and struggling with his sexuality, it really maps onto sort of mid 20th century struggles that a lot of gay men had at that time. So I really learned a lot. I really did want to know more about the Jewish background as well, and how, you know, Sendak's queerness and Jewishness overlapped. I couldn't find much on that when I was doing my research. And, you know, in many ways, the book reads like a super smart biography that is willing to engage with queer theory and with all the adjacent literatures. And that's kind of the best possible version of what one could hope for here. Despite his crankiness, I imagine that Sendak would be properly flattered by this book. So a few things that I want to say. I just want to make there are a few things in the book that really stood out for me. Like, I was not aware of how important queer women were in Sendak's life. And so learning about his editor, Ursula Nordstrom, and then he had a very special person who was a housekeeper, and he was very enchanted with a child called Rosie. You know, this kind of interest in women and girls is, to me anyway, it was moving. It was a way of understanding him outside of the homosocial world of gay men on Fire Island or wherever, and thinking about him in relationship to these other unmarried queer people who were shaping children's literature in really remarkable and irreversible ways. And it's so interesting to think about this buried history of children's literature and how important, and the word keeps coming up in the book, unmarried queer people were to selling several generations on very, very inventive queer material. So a few things. My first encounter with Sendak, which I did not know actually until I read this book, was with the quirky box set that he put out, the Nutshell Library. And I looked it up. I was like, gosh, did I really grow up with these books? And I did. It came out in 1962. I was born in 61. So that would absolutely have been one of my little books that I looked at. And it was, I remember reading it and reading it and reading it and just being bewildered by it. I was like, what's with the soup? Endless with the rice soup, you know? And I absolutely loved the alligators. And I particularly loved the little boy who just kept saying, Pierre, who just kept saying he didn't care, which was absolutely my refrain. It was like, well, you'll go to bed without supper. I don't care. You won't be able to do this. I don't care. And it was a really interesting sort of Bartleby performance, which no doubt Sendak was forced to tidy up at the end so that he finally becomes a caring child. But there's so much non-caring in that story that the resolution is not convincing at all. But I do remember being enchanted with the little box set as a box set. It wasn't just the stories. It was the entire fetish appeal of this object. It was small. The 4 little books slipped in and out of this little nutshell library. The entire concept of it was so appealing to a young person that it didn't really matter to me that the stories were bewildering and probably corrupting me in all the right ways. And so I was willing to like kind of go with the irresolution of the entire thing. And that memory only came to me when I was reading Golan's book and hearing about the Nutshell Library, and also hearing about Sendak's struggles with his publishers who did want him to take some of the really dark material out of the stories and make the stories legible within the language of a kind of moral order that children were being sold on. But as we know from the great success of Where the Wild Things Are, children don't choose moral books any more than when they go to see an animated film, they want a romance at the end. They don't care about romance, and they don't care about the family getting back together. They care about other things. And you can see that Sendak is really, really tapped into that. His his world, the worlds that he created in these books, I would say, were not good and pure at all, which is why they were bewildering. They were not bewildering as worlds. They were bewildering, I think, in relationship to other material that you would have been sold as a kid. You know, those little books stood out so much for me, and I can really, really remember that. But also for the way in which he represented worlds of alienated children. And this is maybe one of the first very deep, very impactful critiques of the family, a critique that in the last year has become very important. And I would direct people to Sophie Lewis's book on abolishing the family, but also to Jules Gill-Peterson's book on the trans child, in which Gill-Peterson suggests that any kind of politics that are being fought over in relationship to the trans child have nothing to do with the trans child and are all about the violence inscribed in the family that then gets projected onto these decisions that people have to make about trans children. So I think that you can find this critique in Sendak's work. There are alienated children, despised parents and caregivers, and animals who might offer something like friendship, which is what adults think that children want, but are also constantly threatening to eat you. You know, there is like the animal is not the fuzzy, furry little kitten I'm going to cuddle up with. The animal in Sendak may well turn around and try to eat you up. Well, as may the adults, just by the way. And there's not a huge distinction made. Lots of people are threatening to gobble lots of people up. And so the menace in the stories, I think, is very, very particular. What else can I say? I think we have to remember that Sendak was writing his stories at a time when it must have been very dangerous, and I kind of want Golan to say more about this, for an unmarried man. And of course, he was not necessarily unmarried. I mean, he had a partner, he had a longtime partner, Eugene Glynn, with whom he was living during a period of time when he was very prolific. And so the fact that he was represented as an unmarried man writing odd and slightly sadistic stories for children is kind of amazing that he got away with it. I mean, I have to say, and I'm sure Golan could tell us more about what a struggle it was for him, both to be closeted and to keep having to, you know, pitch these stories to the publishing industry. But I think that if we consider even today, it would be quite difficult for a odd, queer, eccentric man to sell a readership on slightly sadistic stories. I think we have to really recognize how much Sendak was up against. Okay, I just want to finish by saying that I'm very convinced by Golan's reading of Where the Wild Things Are in Wild Visionary. And Golan, who is really a tremendous writer, sort of passes out the reading. He delivers you little bits and pieces of the reading of Where the Wild Things Are throughout the book, so that there's never just a moment where you get the reading. The reading comes up in multiple places. And that means that you get to know a lot about other things that Sendak did. You're not just reading it for this one thing that you might know about. You learn a lot about the books that were less well known. But there's something I didn't know, and it was funny because I was actually on Fire Island this past weekend when I was reading the book. I mean, I didn't know that Sendak spent a lot of time on Fire Island, and I didn't know that this is where he, you know, maybe he, you know, lived in this kind of queer community that so many people, including Esther Newton, have written about. And I'm convinced by Golan that the Wild Rumpus in some way, shape, or form is an orgy, is you know, a gay male orgy. And there's enough material from the time by Samuel Delaney and Martin Duberman and others to suggest that Wild Rumpus would be about right for the pre-AIDS sexual liberation moment that could well have been a model for the Wild Things. And I want to like applaud that reading, say yes to that reading. And then I want to say that we have to go further. And so in my book, I read Where the Wild Things Are as a queer version and a queer and kind of radical rewriting of the children's story, children's stories that are familiar to us from a kind of colonial context, in which a young person, goes into the wild and is enchanted by the wild, but then must leave again. And this is in many ways the story of Jungle Book, for example. It's the story of many colonial tales. It's the story in some of Jack London's work and so on. But what is different in Sendak's work is the attention to detail. So just before I pass back to our author tonight, to Golan, I want to just share my screen and show you one image from Where the Wild Things Are, right here. Okay, so this is the panel that this is where we can see so much happening. There's a panel on the left, is a panel that I make much of in my book. And this is where the book contains within it a critique of all the tropes that it is also trading on, if you like, right? So it's trading on the trope of the little boy who leaves the domestic comfort of his home. It's like Heart of Darkness as well, right? And sails around the world several times, across years and years, and finally comes to a place where the wild things are. But before we get there, we see Max in the house. And this is, you can see the cross-hatching that Golan actually makes much of cross-hatching in his book, which I really appreciate, and which I wonder if we could think about in relationship to the story itself as a kind of cross-hatch story that brings together the colonial, the queer, and the wild, right? But this panel is so brilliant because on the one hand, you have a boy, but a boy dressed up as a wolf, right? And a boy who is neither on the ground nor flying, but is suspended just above the ground in this, elevated state, if you like. So he's neither grounded nor is he in a completely fantasy space. He's also chasing the family dog. So he's in the costume of a wild animal, but he's chasing the domesticated creature, but he's chasing it to play with it or to eat it. He has a fork in his hand. And so the confusion between the animals that we are afraid of, the animals that we eat, and the animals that we play with are all represented in this one panel. And then just to top it off, on the wall is a painting of a wild thing we're about to meet. And not only is there a painting on the wall, but we see the signature by Max. So Max here is wild thing, author, hunter, hunted, possibly, playful, explorer, traveler, naughty, human, white, colonial, but also in the context of the domestic heteronormative home, colonized. And all of that plays out in every single panel. And I think that we're used to nowadays, because of the attention that has been paid to people like Alison Bechdel's work, we're a bit more used to reading graphic novels for the intense complexity of the graphic novel form and the way in which we're asked to read the gutter, to read the many different layers of meaning that are inscribed both in the text but also in the images themselves. And I think that, there's some lovely material in this book about Spiegelman and Sendak that allows us to line up. And I think Bechdel and Sendak are a really nice pairing to think about in relationship to a very queer relationship to the graphic form. To me, the book Where the Wild Things Are is, in a very, very short space with very, very little text. It asks an enormous number of questions about the wild and the domesticated, the queer and the straight, the domestic and the wild, the colonial and the colonized. And, beautifully, it gives us absolutely no answers. So just, Golan, the questions that I would like to ask you, or I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about Sendak's graphic style. and tell us a little bit more about how the books were made and the drawings were made and so on. I'd love to hear more about scale, smallness and largeness, which is such a big theme in children's books for obvious reasons. And yeah, something about the soup. Tell me, I know it's Jewish chicken soup, but there's got to be something else going on in the soup. Thanks.
Thank you both, Jack and Kenneth. Those are such rich and flattering and beautifully analytical readings and additions to arguments I've made. I think that, I guess to respond to the questions that were just posed, the visual style, I want to actually, I have a copy of the, just going to take these headphones off, a copy of the nutshell library that you were describing. And like really get a sense here of the tiny scale of, in the nutshell, we have Pierre, when was Johnny, chicken soup with rice, and alligators all around. And I think, part of what Sendak was envisioning in this, this is the early 60s, is gesturing back to the kind of chapbooks that we have and more of a pre-modernist or early modern era kind of product created for children, where children handle books that are the size of their own hands, that they can hold in their palms. So really a tactile relationship to books that I think he encourages with this smallness. He described books as central objects. His first novel came from his older sister, and I think it was The Prince and the Pauper. And he describes kind of smelling it and licking it and kind of just being with the book. And the process of reading as also very connected to the relationships in his family and intergenerational relationships, sitting on his father's lap and kind of absorbing the warmth of his father's body, becoming a part of his father's arm, which held him as they read together. So this, and this I think also speaks to Sendak's general understanding of childhood as a time that's more intertwined with adulthood than we tend to admit or allow for, that children are often or always in complicated relationships with adults, with adult matters, regardless of the kind of shielding or compartmentalizing of childhood that we see in various forms in the modern era. And so I think the kind of smallness relates to this desire to create an object that can really be handheld and tactile and sensual. And he's really thinking about the form of the picture book throughout all of his work, right? So up until the 21st century with these pop-up books like Mommy that I showed, Where the Wild Things Are is sometimes described as the first book to, the first kind of full original work of art that was written and illustrated by the same figure that is aesthetically experimental in the sense that it's telling a story that's an emotional journey that is also doing something experimentally on an aesthetic level. So probably the most noted or the most cited aspect of the experimentation formally is the way that the narrow border, the white margin, becomes smaller and smaller as you move forward in the book until you get to the rumpus page, right, where there's no border at all, right? And then slowly retreat back to the home, which becomes increasingly circumscribed. But right, so we shift as the forest grows, and so I think to he's thinking about the page as a whole. He's an artist by his own training. He took a couple of courses at the Art Students League in New York, but he's someone who really related more to the kind of Renaissance model of someone who apprentices and immerses themselves in their craft. He's thinking differently, drawing from international inspirations as well. So he was influenced by several different European creators who also did their books with movable parts and pop-ups, and thinking also about his relationships at Harper, even with Tommy Unger from Alsace-Lorraine, and Also, Edward Gorey was another figure creating, American figure, but creating kind of difficult, morbid situations in which children were involved. So the cross-hatching, I kind of analyze it, especially in the context of his Lots of the Goat collection, which is his illustrations of Isaac Bashevis Singer's Yiddish stories. And I think of it as a kind of threadbare depiction of reality in which we see the substance, the matter of human life kind of dissolving at its seams, which is the way he relates to family memory, the way he, in some ways, I believe related to social reality in general, which I think your work does a really nice job parsing out, Jack, in terms of the more anarchistic elements that we can read into it. And I think that thinking about the rumpus comment, just to respond to that briefly, he describes his work often as, so there's definitely the level of sexuality and potentially even a gay orgy, right? Talking about the context of Fire Island, where he wrote the work, though he did often stay not in the explicitly queer areas, but would most likely venture into those. I think that the way he often described his work was as an exorcism with an O, of needing to get rid of feelings that plagued him throughout his life through his creations. And so he describes, I think there's a similar feeling in Wild Things and the Rumpus as there is in other works like in The Night Kitchen, where Mickey triumphs over these bakers who want to bake him into a cake in his night fantasy. This need to triumph, this need to creatively overcome a social reality that wants to erase, that wants to coerce, that wants to shape a particular subject, and a need to overcome that, which Sendak, I think, in his own biography, in his own life, felt not always so successful in. And I think he was a product of his time, as we've talked about, growing up in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, coming of age before the gay liberation movement, right before much of the attention that we see today to issues of queer and trans experience. He grows up kind of limited socially, despite the energies that influence his work. And I think one thing I just really wanted to emphasize here is that his characters do something that he felt he couldn't do. So Pierre, this naughty child who says, "I don't care, I don't care," he describes as someone who is a kind of symbol for who he couldn't be, the person who says no to the parents, the person who's not overwhelmed by these distant, very emotionally overpowering, but also commanding experiences of real historical trauma as it played out in the present, of seeing the photographs of his cousins and aunts and uncles as they were being killed in concentration camps through his own childhood, right? So he was so wedded to and overcome by his parents' emotions in some respects that his experience of queerness was a layered experience of being able to come into himself beyond the space that's often associated with warmth and safety, especially in terms of diasporic Jewish notions of family as a unit that exists sort of queerly against or despite the restrictions in the dominant society, and that cultivates warmth within that unit. Right, so there's layering of the aloneness and of the erasure that he experiences that I think his work really explores, or is a testament to, and the kind of aloneness of the child. His work was often criticized, to get to the question a little bit about kind of being up against expectations in children's literature. As a peculiar person looking at these queer experiences of childhood, his work was often criticized for depicting, especially in later years, depicting children who enter these freakish spaces, these kind of introverted, nightmarish spaces that and don't rejoin society, or don't sort of wrap up their ability to be social beings by the end of a given picture book. So in Outside Over There, for example, after Ida's ventured out into this other realm to save her kidnapped sister, who was kidnapped by goblins, she returns only to find her mother despondent that father has not returned, and it's still her job to take care of her own mother, who's emotionally unavailable. Father's written a letter saying, "Take care of your sister and your mother. I'm still away." And Sendak writes a note to himself in the original artwork for that to draw a Fire Island sunset at the scene of the father's departure. So there's definitely I think a gesturing toward the kind of queer nautical removed realities of the fluid realms beyond the family domestic sphere. I don't know if I've answered all of the questions that were posed. There was the question of chicken soup, which the most obvious reading is I kind of read it in the context of thinking about camp a little bit, and the kind of recycled artifacts of quote unquote low culture or of one's childhood, or of passionate associations within an in-group. And chicken soup was such an association for Sendak, whose mother, Yiddish-speaking immigrant from Poland, sort of annoyed him or amused him with her her application of chicken soup as the way to solve any ailments. Kind of, if you've ever seen My Big Fat Greek Wedding, the equivalent of Windex in that film, right? The chicken soup for this, chicken soup for that, it solves anything. And so we see chicken soup appearing everywhere across the landscape of that book, across the different seasons and months. And I think the kind of campiness of some of Sendak's work speaks to at least one definition of camp as I think it might be Scott Long, don't quote me on that, as the sort of heroism of those who are not called upon to be heroes. So Sendak is really redeeming or elevating the experiences of children who grow up in an urban kind of neglected experience, sort of bored and unattended to by their parents, who are grasping at straws, sort of creating a reality and expressing themselves with the limited available resources, including references to things like chicken soup or what a mother swears by, right? So I guess maybe I should leave it there because I see the time. I don't know if we're going to take any audience questions.
Yeah, we are at 7 o'clock. This hour went by really quickly. But I would love if anyone has some other questions they want to put in the chat function or just ask out loud real quickly. It's fine for us to go over for a few minutes. I don't want to keep people too long, especially our panelists. But if anyone else has any questions, I know that Ben put in the chat, this feels timely given we're coming up on Pride Month and therefore on seasonal arguments about how sexual, freaky, kinky, queer pride can and should be, given the potential presence of innocent kids who might see something they aren't ready to see. Yeah, that's a whole big topic there to discuss, but I wonder if anyone wants to respond to that.
This isn't a direct response, but and with that question and with Golan was just talking about, I can't help but thinking about, as a point of contrast, Shel Silverstein, all right, who, everybody seems to know that he was a columnist for Playboy and that the Giving Tree sort of, was sketched there, or parts of it were. And so there's this just, and, whereas this context for Sendak is so untold, even though, even though it was clear he wasn't entirely closeted, there were obvious hints. And so just thinking about the way the Wild Rumpus is just part of this canonical architecture, right? And something like the Giving Tree, which is kind of a messed up book in various ways, but everybody's, oh, it's Playboy, it's it's that, it's wacky, that daring Shel Silverstein, So is the difference just kind of homophobia? Is it more about Sendak's still reticence around his around his sexuality? Also, Golan, you mentioned that he instructed his estate to burn the papers, the correspondence and stuff, which meant you had to really lean on practically everything else to kind of tell the story. So I don't know if that's actually so much a question as a free association to the question, but I think it is very much about, the kind of gendering of the innocence question, the sort of sexualization, particular kinds of sexualization, right? Like Tyson Pugh makes the point that children are presumed to be both innocent and straight.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think it's also interesting given the current context of the many attacks across this nation against trans children or people caring for trans children. It is very interesting how often children are at the center of queer discourse of queer, anything to do with queerness. The children, but also what about the queer children?
But you know, in Sendak's work, it isn't simply that the child is expressing an untoward sexuality or is in some way engaged with people who are. And it's usually a he, I think. He's just unwilling to play his role in the family. He's unwilling to be game. You know, I don't care. I don't care. You know, it's more of a withdrawal from the family as such. That then seems to sort of invalidate the family in the process. But I did want to go and hear more about how difficult it was to work with the Sendak archive, because the fact that he had burned as Kenneth reminded us, that he had burned all of his papers. I know when I just wanted to get that one little panel that I read, I wanted permission to put it in my book. And it took me months to get the permission. And then at the last minute, they told Duke that I could only have permission to use it for 5 years. And no book publisher will publish something with an image that would have to come out in 5 years' time, right? So we had to take it out. So I was wondering how you managed with that very closely guarded archive.
Yeah, these are important questions. And I guess to quickly first just to respond to the Shel Silverstein comparison, I think there was a little bit of resentment between at least from Sendak's side of things in terms of the popularity and of Shel Silverstein's work, that he didn't offend. His children's literature, even if he was associated with things like Playboy, he was not offensive in the way that he spoke to children. It was sort of zanier and more playful. I think Tom Younger is a kind of counterexample who he did erotic drawings that were more heteronormative erotic drawings, you could say, but I believe he identified as heterosexual, but was kind of banished from the world of children's literature because he was they were discovered in the midst of his career, and he was coming from a more European sensibilities from Alsace-Lorraine. So yeah, interesting set of questions. But I think that the kind of accusation or suspicion of pedophilia around any queer person creating for children, it has been rampant. And I don't know if it's any better now or not, but it's this was definitely something that I think haunted Sendak throughout his career, and a reason why he was less rebellious and less wild in his own public conversations during his career. Though speaking of the Sendak archive, speaking with people there, it sounded like, based on those conversations, it sounded like that I had with people at the archive or with the estate, that it sounded to me that those who worked with Sendak, those who knew Sendak, even on sort of an informal level, as an acquaintance, were very much aware that he was gay throughout much of his life. It was sort of an open secret, and it was more that the public kind of wasn't interested in knowing, and kind of wanted to keep that information at bay, to look the other way, because it would disturb something about this beloved creator. But yes, the estate does not seem interested in supporting work that is biographical, or that this is not official, but this wasn't officially stated. But my sense is that perhaps there's maybe a little bit of hesitation still for similar reasons around associating Sendak's body of work or life with queerness. And I wonder if, I don't know this, but I wonder if it reflects the same age-old fears about what Sendak's legacy would look like if associated with queerness as a children's artist author. But yeah, definitely not the easiest thing to. And I don't have illustrations or pictures in my book, aside from the cover, which is an image owned by Getty Images, I believe, if I remember correctly.
Thank you, Golan. And since we are about 10 minutes over, I think we should probably wrap it up. But I thank you all for forever associating Maurice Sendak's name with queerness, whatever the estate tries to do. Estates may try and assert their control, but they only have so much power. And I think this is such a fascinating conversation. I'm really excited to read the book. Thank you all so much for joining this and participating in this. It feels like this could be a college course or multiple college courses, which I would love to take. There's a lot of rich material here. So thank you, Kenneth, Jack, and thank you especially Golan for participating in this and for sharing your work with us. As I mentioned, I put in the chat, I'll put it in again. The book is on sale for 25% off until the end of the night. So get it now. And I hope we'll see you all soon. I'm going to be posting this on our YouTube channel. So if you know anyone who wanted to see this but couldn't join, it will live on there. And I guess that's it. Thank you so much. I hope everyone has a lovely night. And I hope we'll see you at some of our upcoming events. We have a lot this weekend. All right, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Have a good night.